Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. We got up to last time with the death of Charlemagne on January 28th, 814. And even though he had many children, his only one son, only one legitimate son, outlived him to inherit. So that spared the Carrolingians for the moment from the curse of Salic law, which was the apportioned inheritance among all the male heirs. So the surviving son's name was Louis. This is Louis the First. He's also called in the Louis the Pious. He inherited all of Charlemagne's empire. This was during the reign of Pope Leo III, and that's where we left off last time. Pope Leo himself died on June 12th, 816. He was followed as Pope 97 by Stephen IV, with fifth in parentheses, for the reason we talked, the Stephen problem. We talked about that already. As it happened, he survived only 7 months. So, let's move on. He was followed as Pope 98 by Saint Pascal I, who accepted election on the 24th of January, 817. He was born in Rome to the Massimo family. The house of Massimo was aristocratic, very ancient. They claimed descent from Fabius Maximus, the man who defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War. Pascal was the younger son given to the church in keeping with the feudalism pattern. He was educated at the Lateran school and served in the papal curia. Later, on his own initiative, he entered monastic life. He became abbot of San Stefano in Rome, and that was his position when he was elected Pope 98. And he reigned for 7 years. So, this next unit, we finished with the Carrolingians. As I said, even though there are other Carrolingians like Louis, we ended that unit because now the momentum of history is going to move away from the Carrolingians, just as the Merovingians outlived, their time, their high time, before they fell. So this unit is just going to be on the 9th century. It was a pretty bleak time. There's not all that much to point to, as things start to disintegrate, and there are reasons for that. Which we'll get to, but that's what this unit will be. I don't know if we'll finish it in one session, but certainly it shouldn't take more than 2. In the year 813, the Byzantine emperor, the Eastern emperor of the moment, was killed in battle against the Bulgarians, after which a general, a strategos, and the Byzantine army carried out a successful coup d'etat, placing himself on the throne. He had the deceased emperor's sons castrated in order to render them incapable of being a threat to him, because then they couldn't have an heir. So a eunuch cannot be king. This guy took the name Leo V. He's also called in Byzantine history Leo the Armenian, for obvious reasons. He was from Armenia. He was an iconoclast. He seized on the endlessly repeated but never substantiated story of the ignorant peasants using icons in place of godparents at baptisms. And on that basis, he summoned theologians to the capital to discuss the problem, the icon problem, again. The result was that in the year 814, he opened the second period of Byzantine iconoclasm, which lasted from 814 to 842. And he initiated it by having the icon of Christ removed from the palace gate and replaced with a simple cross with no corpus, no body, just the cross. The patriarch of Constantinople, the bishop of Constantinople at that point, was Saint Nicephorus. He denounced this action as contradicting the Second Council of Nicaea, which was the Seventh Ecumenical Council that took place 27 years earlier in 787. For his trouble of pointing this out, the bishop was arrested, tortured, and exiled. He never returned. He died in exile. The iconodule cause, meaning those who do venerate icons and sacred images, was then led by the abbot of the monastery of St. John the Forerunner. That's one way of referring to St. John the Baptist. This monastery was more commonly known as the Studion, named for a Roman consul, Studius, who endowed it in 462. By this point, it was an immense monastery, capable of housing 700 monks. Monks in that monastery were called Studites and were renowned for their calligraphy, manuscript illumination, and liturgical hymns, liturgical music. The abbot who took up the iconodule cause after the unjust banishment of Bishop Nicephorus was Saint Theodore the Studite. The Emperor Leo V summoned a synod to meet in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople in April of the following year, 815. Wanting to avoid the appalling excesses and sadism of the last iconoclast persecution, many bishops and abbots who attended just wanted to find some sort of compromise, whereby icons could be used for devotion within churches, but they would not be used outdoors. They would not be used in processions, nor would they be used on the exterior of buildings. But Leo was not satisfied with that. He demanded that icon veneration, that the use of sacred images, be condemned altogether. Out of fear, frankly, because they remember, it was only, iconoclasm was only ceased as official policy 27 years earlier. So these guys all remembered, what happened. So to avoid that, they agreed. The majority, not every single one, but a numerical majority agreed. Among the minority who disagreed was Abbot St. Theodore the Studite. He vigorously defended the veneration of icons as legitimate, quoting verbatim from memory the teaching of Nicaea II, which was approved by the previous Byzantine ruler, the Empress Irene. He then went farther and condemned the very idea of an emperor having a right to interfere in theological matters at all. The synod, the majority of those attending the synod, followed the emperor's wishes in reaction to this, declared St. Theodore a heretic, and therefore deposed, which is not canonical, of course, but the emperor had guys with swords who were going to do what he said, so it happened. The emperor then had the saint right there in the synod, had the saint stripped and scourged in the courtyard outside of the church, and then exiled. And like St. Nicephorus, he also died in exile. The Emperor Leo V was then in his turn assassinated in the year 820 in Hagia Sophia Church. And his own sons underwent orchiectomy, or castration, as he had done to the previous emperor's sons. The problem with iconoclasm would continue because his successor was also an iconoclast, so the policy continued. Pope Pascal died on February 11th, 824. Of course, he had no way to be involved in this at all. As the emperor didn't. I mean, so this is another schism, yet another schism between, Catholic and Orthodox, or Greek, Constantinople and Rome. So the one that happens in 1054, the one that's still in effect, I mean, that certainly wasn't the first one. I mean, there were literally over a dozen, if counting from the patristic period on, of these schisms. He was followed as Pope 99 by Eugene II, who accepted election. He was serving as a priest, archpriest of Santa Sabina in Rome. He was from an aristocratic family, given to the church, younger son, had a long record of service in the city, was well known by everyone, clergy and laity. He accepted election on June 5th, 824, reigned for 3 years and 3 months. In the same year, 824, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, wrote to the new Pope, Eugene, arguing that he, the Pope, should compromise on the iconoclasm issue with the new Byzantine Emperor, Michael II. Michael II was a career army officer. He's the one who murdered his predecessor in 820. He officially maintained the policy of iconoclasm, but he wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor, to Louis I, sort of circumventing the Pope, and claimed that he had halted overt persecution. But he wanted Louis to convince the Pope to simply agree that adoring images was wrong. And in return, Michael, would not actually punish those who used images. Pope Eugene refused, of course, to do this, so the issue remained open. Iconoclasm remained open, and the schism continued. Pope Eugene died on August 27th, 827. He was followed as Pope 100 by Valentine. Yes, that was his name, Valentine, the 100th Pope, and that is the only Pope who ever took that name, Valentine. So that's how seminarians, if you want to remember that little factoid, a papal fun fact, 100th Pope named Valentine. Now, this is not Saint Valentine. That's earlier, from the period of the persecutions. But he only reigned 40 days, August into September. So, moving on. He was followed as Pope 101 by Gregory IV, another member of the Roman aristocracy, younger son, sent into the church by his family, educated at the Lateran school. He accepted election in September of 827. The exact date was not recorded in the Liber Pontificalis. During his reign, the second Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne's son, died in 840. And he did it again, so the Carolingian Empire was spared the Lex Salica, apportioned inheritance, when Charlemagne died, because all of Louis' siblings, died before Charlemagne. But Louis had multiple children. He had a total of 10 children from 3 different women. 2 of whom were wives, and 1 was, not. By the time Louis died, 3 of the legitimate sons were still alive. So the empire was divided again. It did it again among these 3. One, Charles II. He's called Charles the Bald, which he got what is now France. Louis II, who's called Louis the German, so obviously he got Germany. Lothar, or Lothar, received the title of Holy Roman Emperor, and he received the land in between France and Germany. Initially, it was called Lotharingia. Now, you can deduce a few things from that. You know, the others, Charles II got France, Louis II got Germany. You've heard of France and Germany. They're still around. There still, is a France, still is a Germany. But there is not a Lotharingia. So, you can deduce what happened to that. The area in between those two, that is Belgium, the Netherlands, going north to south. Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, which is the Rhineland, you follow on the Rhine River, Switzerland, and northern Italy. Let's see. Well, you see this. This atlas has it by countries, so it's not gonna show the whole thing. Well, anyway, it didn't work. I'll just leave it at that. It's just, so we've seen those maps before. So the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, Switzerland, northern Italy. That swath of territory between France to the west and Germany to the east was Lotharingia. Now, this arrangement, this had zero chance that this was going to survive. Wars among the three sons were continuous. Now they were all sons of Louis, but they did not all have the same mother, so you have that additional problem. Wars among these three were continuous. One of them was responsible for the first written example of French as a language distinct from Latin. In 842, Louis the German and Charles the Bald met at Strasbourg and pledged oaths of loyalty to each other and against their brother Lothar. Because of the betrayals of the previous years, fighting had been countless. This oath of Strasbourg was sworn in front of the leading men among the followers of each king. As an additional security measure, the oath was not only made in Latin, but also in the language of the king's other men, of the other king's men. So Charles the Bald, who's the king of France, he swore the oath in Old High German before the lords the Adligen, before the comitatus who followed Louis the German. And Louis the German swore the oath in Old French before those following Charles the Bald. The substance of the oath, they adhered to the oath for several minutes, after it was pledged, but it was broken, as all the other agreements were. But this is historically significant as further evidence of the development of France and Germany as proto-nations. It's too early to speak of nations, but just see them developing separate identities, even though they were brought together in the Carolingian Empire by Charles Martel, Pepin, and Charlemagne. Even though they were for a time part of the same empire, as that empire disintegrates, and this is part of it, the three sons that inherit that it's part of it. So as the empire disintegrates, then they, like the Germans start to think of themselves as really distinct, not as people in the same empire, but as distinct people from the French. And so ethnic hatred is going to come, is going to feed on this. And the French and the Germans will be at each other's throats ever since. I mean, from the 1,000 years. I mean, from this point to World War II, they were fighting. And Alsace-Lorraine changed hands back and forth, countless times since. An additional element, the division of the empire in 840, 840 was one of the factors in the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire, but not the only one. At this point, we are reintroduced to Islam. Recall that Muslim pirates, whom the West collectively refer to as Saracens, regularly prowled the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the Aegean. Southern Italy, at the time, was in the same state of complete lawless chaos that northern Italy had been, the rest of Italy had been, when the Roman Empire fell. And then again after the Byzantine reconquest failed, after the Gothic Wars. As a result, each town in Italy, well, not every single town, but in each region there was a town that, that tended to be wealthier, and they could afford to build better walls, and a particular town in a region became a city and became dominant in the region. So they came to be ruled by whoever was the strongest, whoever had some guys with weapons who were willing to follow them. After a generation of this anarchy, some of the southern Italian bandits came up with the idea of hiring Saracen pirates as mercenaries to give themselves an advantage over other bandits against the cities that were fortified enough to resist, having to pay protection money. The Saracen pirates were happy to take their money, happy to oblige. And then this is the Federati pattern all over again, because that just works out so well every time it's used. They then capitalized on the fighting among the Christians in Italy to conquer the island of Sicily for themselves in 827, just as the Federati had done. Set up their own, well, they didn't call it a kingdom, but there was an emirate. Pope Gregory IV was deeply shaken by this development. He constructed a huge fortress at Ostia, the port of Rome. He also rebuilt an ancient Roman aqueduct that had been allowed to decay to bring fresh water to the Janiculum Hill in Rome, which is on the same side of the river as the Vatican. So classical Rome, the Forum, where Caesar was assassinated, the Senate, that was all on the other side of the river. So with this, so remember your nexus, to orient yourself. So here's Rome, and you go up almost in a straight line from Rome up to Ravenna. See Ravenna down to Rome. It's your line. Then up here is Milan. Southeast of Milan is Pavia. That was the Lombard capital, but they've been conquered, so they don't really matter anymore. Down here is Naples, just above the fold, and down here is the island of Sicily. And all right, so Palermo, Sicily, Rome, Ravenna, and Venice. See, all on the line. So that's to orient yourself. Yeah. The places I'll be referring to. That was in 827. In 836, Viking pirates sacked and pillaged the city of Utrecht which we visited so many times, since Bonhoeffer. It was a base of evangelization in the Netherlands. And also the cities of Antwerp. And in 837, the next year, they came back and sailed up the Rhine River and sacked the city of Nijmegen, still in the Netherlands. The word, so now we have to talk about these people, the Vikings. The word Viking is a general term describing a group of ethnically and linguistically related peoples populating Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The word means one who comes from fjords. Fjord is a Scandinavian word for bay. The Vikings were a people of great physical prowess, at the time believing in a pagan mythology and practicing a savage warrior ethos. They enjoyed an advantage of military technology, which they call the Drakkar, but is generally in English referred to as the long ship. So the Drakkar is the dragon ship, because they put a dragon head, on front of the ship, but it's the long ship. Narrow, long and narrow, shallow draft, having both sail and oars. The Drakkar was the most maneuverable amphibious assault craft prior to the modern development of engines. The Vikings were, hyperbole aside, just absolutely ferocious in battle and merciless to their victims. They were essentially the terrorists of the period. They first appeared sacking, obviously they exist. There were people living, in Scandinavia before, but they first appeared as Vikings and start to think of them as such, as these, rampaging, amphibious criminals, sacking the English port of Dorset in 789. They sacked the famous English monastery of Lindisfarne, which we talked about, on June 8th, 793. That eventually resulted in the abandonment of the site. They made literally hundreds, no figure of speech, hundreds of recorded raids against England, Scotland, Ireland, exploiting the disunity and conflict on those islands, just as the Muslims exploited the disunity and conflict in Sicily and southern Italy. The raid into the Netherlands, however, which is why I'm mentioning them now, and up the Rhine during the reign of Gregory IV, represented a major escalation. The Carolingian Empire, which was already in trouble because it was divided, when Louis died, it presented an opportunity, because the three brothers were killing each other, so their military resources were occupied elsewhere, and so the Vikings saw an opportunity, which they exploited. As with other military catastrophes, to follow the Viking saga would be fascinating, but it would take us too far afield from church history. So instead, we'll summarize the influence that the Viking raids, this just became a part of life, in Western Europe from this point for a significant time, generations. What the influence it had on the church, and the influence it had on society, but focusing on how the church responded. And it was quite innovative what the church did. Given it was a bad situation. All right, so we'll summarize this in 3 main points, and then we'll develop the third point more. So the first point is it solidified feudalism. And we already saw back in the section on Bede where feudalism came from, how it developed. So feudalism did not develop just in response to the Vikings. It was already there. But it solidified feudalism now as the only viable system of defense. That defense had to be local. Each place, had to be able to fortify and defend itself, or it just couldn't be anymore. And then they just had to move. If a little village just didn't have the resources for that, then they had to move, or they had to get under the protection of somebody. Which means practical government and military defense became a local responsibility. Second, mounted, armored cavalrymen became the Western tactical response to the Viking longship. No attempt. So Europe just decided on a defensive strategy. Rather than try to invade Scandinavia to go hit them in their homeland, or rather than try to meet them on the open sea, because nobody in France and Germany knew how to make the longships, or how do you find them? So rather than do that, rather than just try to invade, which would have been the ancient Roman way, just go to the home country, exterminate all the males, settle the legions there to intermarry with the females, and then that culture is just gone. But now with the Carolingian Empire disintegrating, they just didn't have the resources for that. Charlemagne would have done that. Pepin would have done that. Charles Martel certainly would have done that. But the three guys, Charles the Bald, Louis the German, and Lothar of Lotharingia, just didn't. So the tactical response would be this. So the limitation of the longship is it could only carry so many men. And when they landed, they were on foot. And it'd be maybe a couple of dozen. Now, some of the longships, as they perfected the technology, they could carry a couple of hundred, but still, they were limited. So a charge against guys on foot, a few dozen guys on foot, by mounted men wearing armor could defeat them. It could work. That's exactly how a Viking raid was repelled by the monastery of Jarrow in England in 794. A Viking war party went up the rivers. There's the Wearmouth, the monastery of Wearmouth and Jarrow. That's where Bede we talked in there. And this is after Bede, but 60 years after Bede. So the monks got out and they said these Vikings are coming on foot. The monks knew what happened to Lindisfarne, and they had made spears and just things out of wood for themselves. They got on horses and charged. And so the Vikings saw that, these crazy monks coming in. So they left. They got back on their longship and left. Because they're criminals. And, they want to go to an easy target. They don't want to go to some place that's going to fight back. Now, when they did engage and fight, they were fearsome. But they were not invincible. They were just men. They bleed. So, which means they could be killed. Third, the church, over time, allegorized the cavalryman into the medieval knight. Mounted cavalry were not an invention of the Middle Ages. Alexander the Great, conquered all the way to the Indus River using mounted cavalry, so that was certainly nothing new. But the development of medieval cavalry in the context of the highly stratified society of feudalism, and in an environment which was entirely Catholic by this point, thanks to all the developments we covered in the Merovingian and Carolingian period, resulted in something new. Seeing the necessity of a militarized society for self-defense against the Vikings in the north and the Saracens in the south, the church sought to place this need within a higher spiritual context. The result was the creation of a theology of medieval knighthood. The knight eventually developed into a social title, and later in the Middle Ages would come to be associated with poetry and romance. But this was an aberration. This was a deterioration from what it would have been unrecognizable and even laughable to the first knights in the 9th century, when self-defense was their purpose. The key to this theological construct was the symbolic universe which an entirely Catholic society shared, and which made allegory and mystical interpretations possible and meaningful. It began with what already existed, the cavalry. The French word for horse was cheval. The word for a man who rode the horse into battle was the chevalier. The code of honor by which the chevalier lived was chivalry. And this brings us to, you could either call it another point or just an elaboration of point 3. This code of chivalry expressed the medieval ideal of manhood. These ideals, of course, were not always met, because people are people. But the idea was there, and they were known. They were widely known and admired. The church deliberately promoted such ideals that served, or at least attempted to serve, as a corrective to residual barbarian behavior. For example, as taught by the church, it's sort of like the theology of knighthood and chivalry. A knight, now not all people who fought, there were professional soldiers who were not knights, who did not live this way. So this is a subset. So one who did choose to live as a knight. A knight was pious in the practice of the faith. A knight trained daily in the use of the lance, the sword, the shield, and the horse, because he must be ready to fight at a moment's notice. And when battle did come, a knight would show no fear, even if he felt it. Obviously he would feel it. So from this, we can deduce a few things. The knight is a professional soldier. It's not a militia. And he has to have some resources. His horses cost money. And armor costs money. Swords cost money. All the equipment. And then it costs money, so you have to eat and have a place, for the horse. You have to pay somebody to take care of it all. And all that means money. If you're going to be a professional full-time soldier, that means money. Some kind of resources. Third, a knight gave unswerving loyalty. A knight, ideally, would behave with a courteous reserve towards others, especially women. A knight would speak little, but when he did speak, he would always speak the truth, regardless of the cost to himself. A knight, again ideally, was a force to keep the peace by slaying invaders from the outside, like the Vikings, or enforcing the law against domestic bandits. Because the Vikings weren't the only ones. There were people who were just already there, and they just chose a life of crime. And they took advantage of the breakdown of society to live as bandits. So, and a knight would also be a force to defend people from that. Because of the decentralized society, a knight must always expect to stand alone. Hence the use of the heavy armor. Now, and if summoned to the bottom, to the Metairie, then they'd have the group, and then they have the, it's Hollywood, the charge, the cavalry charge. But just on a regular basis, a guy, or one or just a few guys, had to be ready to fight alone. That's the the part of the thing with the armor. Now, the preparation of a boy to become a man such as this took time, and it was through the apprenticeship model. He would be a page, then a squire, and finally a knight. By the time, in this period, in the 9th century, by the time a man was a knight, he had already proven himself in battle. He had already killed on the battlefield. And in this early period, any knight could confer knighthood on one he deemed worthy. So if the squire serving his knight, after, a few battles, he proved himself, then, on the battlefield, that night, he could do it, and then he'd be recognized. But as things developed, as the knighthood, as this paradigm worked, and to defend, at least the interior of Europe, and then society could stabilize more. As it developed, then knighthood would be accorded, conferred in a religious ritual that was public and in church. This would be the accolade, or in the French, the adoubement, the dubbing with the sword. For that, if it took place that way, as opposed to on the battlefield, then the knight-to-be would fast in preparation for the ritual. On the night before, he would take a ceremonial bath and then be dressed in a white robe with a white belt. He would spend the night in vigil, watching, as they would say, the vigil, in prayer, in a chapel or church, either before the altar of a favorite saint or before the altar of a lady. In the morning, then, he would hear Mass, and then the adoubement would take place, the dubbing, He would take vows of allegiance to his particular lord or king. He would take a vow of chastity, which is not celibacy. So chastity means that he would remain celibate until marriage, but, he would envision being married, whereas celibacy is lifelong. And once, chastity means that once married, he would be faithful to his wife. He vowed to protect the weak, to uphold the law of God and the laws of the realm. His weapons and armor would be blessed. He would be dubbed on the shoulder with the sword. In some periods, he might also be struck on the face as a reminder. And this survived in the old confirmation ritual. The bishops used to do that. They'd slap, it's like to remember, as you remember what happened. And then he would be told to rise a knight in the name of God. As Europe became more secure, largely because of the success of medieval knighthood, and then meaning that the prospect of dying any day, in a surprise battle, faded, then chivalry itself became debased into an elaborate charade of refined manners at the royal court. But while it lasted, particularly in these chaotic years of the 9th and 10th centuries, the knight was one of the most successful efforts of catechesis and a blending of theology under the guidance of the church, addressing a social necessity, of self-defense. And it was an attempt to redeem the brutality of a savage world by placing the necessity of self-defense within a religious context. Pope Gregory IV died on January 25th, 844. Followed as Pope 102 by Pope Sergius II. Another one, a younger son of an aristocratic family, given to the church, educated at the Lateran school. In his youth, he was a prominent member of the Lateran Cathedral's Schola Cantorum, the school of singing, school of chanting, the school of music. He was ordained by Pope Pascal I, made a cardinal archpriest of Saints Martin and Sylvester Church by Gregory IV. He reigned as Pope 102 for 3 years. During his reign, in August of 846, Saracen pirates mounted another attack against Italy. This was a major attack on the port city of Ostia, which is the port of Rome. During this attack, the entire garrison of the fortress fled. They ran away. Just total shame. So the pirates sacked the port of Ostia, burned the buildings after they had removed everything that they wanted. Any female or young person they captured was chained for sale on the Muslim slave markets. Then as they proceeded to go back to their ships, they looked around and they said, nobody's coming. We just spent all our time doing this. They know we're here because the garrison ran away, and they assumed the garrison went to go get reinforcements. And they look around and nobody's coming. So, seeing no counterattack, they said, okay, see what we can get away with. So they kept moving inland toward the city of Rome. They sacked St. Paul outside the walls, and then, most shameful of all, they were allowed to sack and pillage St. Peter's Basilica. Then they crossed the Tiber River into the vicinity of ancient Rome. But once crossing the river in that area, they ran into the Aurelian Wall, which was built in antiquity. It was not in good repair, but it was still more of an obstruction than pirates could handle, because these guys came on ships. They obviously didn't have siege equipment. And they were just probing just to see how far they could get, and so they learned. So then they withdrew. But they were going to come back. Pope Sergius died on January 27th, 847. Followed as Pope 103 by Saint Leo IV. A Roman priest, had a different path. He started his clerical life of his own volition. He was not sent into it by the church. He was originally a Benedictine monk in the Abbey of St. Martin in Rome, ordained a priest by Gregory IV, made a cardinal by Pope Sergius II. He accepted election on April 10th, 847, reigned for 8 years and 3 months as Pope, later Saint Leo IV. The unopposed sack of Rome, at least on the Vatican side of the river, prompted by the Saracen pirates, was followed by a series of raids along the coastal Italian cities. They thought, how much can we get away with? Complicating matters, the successful raid on Rome prompted the leader, who was a Shiite Berber pirate named Calhoun, to establish a permanent base on the Italian peninsula. To this end, he captured the port city of Bari, B-A-R-I. That's the heel of Italy. The Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, remember the Abbasids were Shiites also, was so delighted that he bestowed the title of Emir on Calhoun. So the Emirate of Bari was a Muslim sovereignty in Italy, just as Narbonne or Arbona in Septimania in southern France had been, and until they were driven out. Pepin drove them out, and as the Muslims in Spain was another Islamic sovereignty until Ferdinand and Isabel drove them out in 1492. So here we have one on the mainland of Italy. The capture of Bari presented the ominous possibility that the Muslims would simply conquer Italy, as they had North Africa and Spain and so many other ancient Christian lands. The Pope could not, permit this, or whether, at least he had to try to stop it, and so he resolved to fight. But what do? There's no satellite reconnaissance. There's no aircraft. How do you? These are pirates. So how do you go at them? They're in Bari, so at least you know that. There are also some in Sicily, so you know that. But Leo decided to let the Muslims do all the work for him, of assembling their navy and coming to him at a place of his choosing for battle, so he could be prepared, and then he would have the advantage. Well, how do you do this? Well, Leo turned the sin on the sinner. The sin was greed, of course, but in order to capitalize on that, he used the sin of others who were not Muslims, but were fellow Christians, but had some weaknesses. Leo let it be known Well, I should put it this way. You probably know in your life, or have at some point, that there are certain people, if you say something in front of them, that within minutes, the entire hemisphere is going to know exactly what you said. You know these people. Now, there are other types, you could say it and you never hear it again. But you know there are those, and you know who they are. You know that whatever you say to them, within minutes, Earth is going to know about it. And of course, Leo knew who these people who were in his sphere. So he leaked it. To these people, he let it be known to these people that he was worried because of the sack of Rome, and he was worried that the papal treasure, would then be taken the next time the Muslims came. So to prevent that from happening, he was going to move the papal treasure from Rome to France. He was going to ask the Carolingians to guard it for him. And so, he leaked this out, and it eventually leaked, that where it was going to be, what day, how they were going to transport it. Coincidentally, they were going to transport it on ships, because he wanted the Saracens to go try to intercept it. He leaked the story, and sure as he knew, a Lombard, the Lombard Duke of Benevento, his name was Rodelcus, could not resist. He went to the Saracens and told them he had this knowledge. He wanted money for his information, and he wanted their help. And in return, they would split the money, and then Rodelcus would stay in Rome. That he would add the Duchy of Rome to the Duchy of Benevento, because that was, we saw that, and we talked about the Lombards and the Carolingian unit. Leo knew that the Lombards were incapable of resisting the temptation to betray, and that they would sell the information. And the Muslims took the bait. The papal treasure. Everyone believed that exists. People still believe that, even though, the church. How many parishes and schools have we closed? Just in this generation, and then you have people, the treasure. The church's treasure. We have these, the rooms full of gold and silver and diamonds and jewels. Yet we can't keep up. Oh God, it's getting late. Okay. They took the bait. They made a raid on the port of Ostia on the day and the time that Leo leaked the treasure was going to be moved. But instead of the fabled papal treasure, the Muslims found a trap waiting for them. They were decisively defeated at the Battle of Ostia in 849. Leo had the Muslim ship captains who were captured beheaded. He put the rest of the captured Muslim crews on chain gangs to work repairing the damage to Ostia and Rome, which they caused in the previous raid. The traitor Rodelcus, the Duke of Benevento, was assassinated by parties unknown. The only purely theological problem to occur during the reign of Pope Leo was a heretical interpretation of St. Augustine, which would end up recurring several times in church history. In this case, the exponent was an apostate Benedictine monk named Gottschalk of Orbay. That's Gottschalk. Gottschalk was born in Reims in the year 800. For reasons which have not been recorded, he was given as an infant to the Benedictine Abbey of Fulda. Remember Fulda, founded by St. Sturm, who we talked about, who was a disciple of St. Boniface. Fulda is in Germany. So this is the feudalism problem, that he's just given by his family to the monastery, so yet a person without a vocation, forced into monastic life. Gottschalk, as he grew from infancy to, in the monastery, he developed a deep aversion to the point of hatred of monasticism, of monastic life. He asked to be returned to the lay state. This request was denied because it was the custom of the day that children given to the church would simply spend the rest of their lives in the church. He was, however, allowed to move to another monastery, the Abbey of Orbay in France. At Orbay, which had a substantial library, he began studying the writings of St. Augustine. He began imagining himself as a great scholar. From this pride, so it's pride, he had an insight into St. Augustine that previous people didn't. He was going to be creative, creative in his theology, in his interpretation, and his teaching. So when you unite pride with this desire to be creative and avant-garde in theology, the result is going to be a heresy. He taught double predestination. Now, seminarians, this is a heresy. So I'm only mentioning it because in the third year course we're going to see the fullness of this, or at least a version of this with Calvinism. Where this came from. Remember, nothing just happens. So double predestination. The first predestination is that some who were created by God, were predestined by God for salvation. And there was nothing they could do to change it. The second predestination, that there were those who were created by God for damnation. And there was nothing they could do to change that. From this position, he then extrapolated that God did not want everyone to be saved. So Jesus did not die for everyone. He only died for the first predestined, for those predestined for salvation, the spiritual elite. The abbot of Orbay, quite properly, silenced him. Said, no. That Jesus didn't say that. He didn't say that he only came to, for the so no. He silenced him. Angry that no one appreciated his brilliance, Gottschalk ran away. He escaped the abbey in 840, wandered around Europe for 9 years, spreading this. He was captured in Italy in 849. He preached it to the wrong people in Italy, and they arrested him and they brought him to the Pope. Said this guy won't shut up. And the Pope sent him back to his abbey for judgment. And that abbey was under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Reims, who was at the time a guy named Hincmar. So Hincmar gave Gottschalk the opportunity to recant and to demonstrate it publicly by burning his writings. Gottschalk refused. So Hincmar had him publicly flogged and imprisoned for what turned out to be the rest of his life. And he died unrepentant. It could have ended any time, but he died unrepentant. Hincmar then authored a reply to double predestination at a synod in his province of Reims, and this was approved by Pope Leo IV. So to summarize, first, obviously God wants the salvation of everyone, because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. We know that from Genesis 1. Second, therefore, Jesus did sacrifice himself for the salvation of all. Third, the human will remains free to sin after baptism, so we need sanctifying grace in order to be saved. And that's it. That was his response. So if you're interested, especially seminarians, if you want to refresh your memories, the Church does have an authentic teaching on predestination, what that means. And it does not mean what Gottschalk thought it meant. That is summarized in number 600 of the Catechism. And on grace, the necessity of grace for salvation, sanctifying grace, that's in number 2000 of the Catechism, paragraph 2000. Yeah, no. Pope Leo died on July 17th, 855. Followed as Pope 104 by Benedict III. And then now we return to the pattern of a younger son of an aristocratic family given to the church. He accepted election on September 29th, 855. During his reign, in 847, the son of the Byzantine emperor, Michael, was made Patriarch of Constantinople. This guy's name was Nicetas. He was born as Nicetas. But in religion, he took the name Ignatius. He had been forcibly castrated in 813 at the age of 16 in order to remove him as a possible contender for the imperial throne when his father was assassinated. Seeking solace in religion, Nicetas entered monastic life. That's where he took the name Ignatius. Became well known in Eastern monastic circles for his piety and his devotion to icons. His mutilation was not held against him because everyone knew the circumstances, and they had the evidence of his adult life of sanctity to weigh in his favor. So his appointment as bishop, Patriarch of Constantinople in 847, was no surprise and was welcomed by most. Most even, but not all, because there were some Eastern prelates who favored some form of compromise to bring back iconoclast clergy and iconodual clergy, to reunify the church. One former iconoclast was Gregory, the Archbishop of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, which technically was under the jurisdiction of Constantinople, but Sicily had been conquered by the Muslims, so and functionally he was like the Christians in Syria and in Egypt and the Holy Land. During his ceremony of installation as patriarch, Ignatius ordered Gregory to leave the church as an unrepentant iconoclast, and later held a synod which proclaimed Gregory deposed and excommunicated. Gregory appealed this to the Pope, to Pope Benedict III. Now, this is a huge problem for the Pope. Patriarch Ignatius was known to be a man of profound holiness. He had been a strong supporter of iconodules, also of the Holy See, neither of which Gregory of Syracuse had ever been. So before acting against a man like Ignatius, Pope Benedict ordered an investigation and ordered Gregory to appear in Rome for the inquiry. Now, the Pope died before this issue was resolved, so stay tuned. It's coming. Meanwhile, the Byzantine emperor of that particular minute in time was named Bardas. Bardas developed an infatuation with his daughter-in-law. He put aside his wife in order to marry her, and made her put aside her spouse in order to marry him. The Bishop Ignatius publicly rebuked him and refused him communion at a packed mass on the Epiphany, and stated that he was living in a state of objective mortal sin, so he would not be able to receive communion until that objective state ended. And so de facto he was excommunicated, for which the emperors don't take this well. So for this, the emperor had him arrested. Pope Benedict died with all this unresolved on April 17th, 858. Pope 105 was Saint Nicholas I, another younger son of an aristocratic family, born in Rome, 820, given to the church, educated at the Lateran school. Accepted election April 24th, 858. He inherited the problem, the Ignatius problem. First, the appeal of Gregory of Syracuse against Ignatius's removal of him. Then also the problem of Ignatius being unjustly imprisoned by the Byzantine emperor. That emperor, Bardas, pressured enough bishops in the East to agree to this unjust action, to depose Ignatius, because Ignatius had denied him communion, and to replace Ignatius as Bishop of Constantinople with one of Bardas's favorites, a guy named Photius, Photius. At the time, Photius was a layman. He was a scholar, well known as a scholar, but still a layman. So Bardas's stooge bishops ran Photius through the sacramental prerequisites in sacrilegious haste in 858. The rightful Patriarch Ignatius was still alive. He was subjected to horrific torture in order to pressure him into voluntarily abdicating. He bore every torture with a dignity that speaks of a profound spiritual depth. All of his teeth were pulled out. He was deprived of food for long periods. He became an invalid from being kept chained to the floor for weeks at a time without being able to stand or walk. This physical torture was alternated with mental torture, which included more than once being placed inside of a coffin, the coffin nailed shut and put in a mausoleum and left there, for a day or two to let him believe that he was just going to be, left there, buried alive. Still, unbelievably, he did not break. In 859, the false patriarch, the anti-patriarch, Photius, wrote to the new Pope Nicholas I. And the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, also wrote to him, Bardas. They indicated that Ignatius was rightfully deposed by a synod of bishops for having neglected his duties, of all things, when in fact it was because he was adhering to his duty that this happened. And they said he was deposed because his election, his appointment as bishop, was invalid because of the impediment of his castration, and that had never been canonically dispensed. Now, Pope Nicholas, of course, he didn't believe this for a moment, but because of the distances involved, and because he had no effective means of enforcement in Greece, he had to move cautiously. So he wrote back, suggesting that he send 2 papal legates to Constantinople to investigate the matter, in order to formulate procedures so that such a problem might not arise in the future. The following year, on June 18th, 860, without warning, 200 Russian pirate ships just showed up from the north coast of the Black Sea down south to the Constantinople's on the southern coast of the Black Sea, and started plundering the cities and the villages along the coast. The emperor was, there were actually co-emperors at the time. The one emperor, Michael III, just lived in an alcoholic stupor, so he just stayed drunk in the palace. Whereas the co-emperor, whom we've already met, Bardas, just ran away. The city of Constantinople was too well fortified to be taken by pirates, even 200 ships full. But the people could clearly see the smoke from the plundered towns and cities along the coast, which were not so fortunate. Now, like all pirates, these guys eventually went away, but it kind of made an impression. The next year, in April of 861, the two papal legates arrived. Zachary, the Bishop of Anagni, and Rodald, the Bishop of Porto. These two overtures were made to these two, lubricated by gold, and they succumbed to this temptation of bribery. At a synod, or before they attended the synod, so they were already turned, they were suborned by the time they went to the synod in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. At this synod, which was a kangaroo, court, it was a drumhead trial, they listened to a parade of 72 actors who delivered a catalog of lies, scripted lies, about Patriarch Ignatius. Now, of course, he was, of course, not allowed to speak or even to meet the papal legates. At the end of all of this, the two legates signed a document confirming that his appointment as bishop and his ordination as bishop had been invalid. Therefore, the patriarchate was vacant until Photius was put in place, and so Photius was the rightful patriarch. Pope Nicholas had a spy who kept him informed of what was really happening. This was Theonostus. He was the abbot of the monastery of Santa Sophia in Constantinople, longtime friend and supporter of Ignatius. Pope Nicholas was enraged when he heard. So the abbot wrote to him. And so Nicholas knew before the papal legates got back home. He already knew. So when the guilty pair made it back to Rome, he removed them from their diocese. He then summoned a synod of bishops to meet at the Lateran in April of 863, at which he proclaimed Photius a criminal, a false patriarch, and guilty of sacrilege for his material cooperation in the mistreatment of Ignatius. Nicholas then took the fateful step of excommunicating Photius, the man whom the Byzantine emperor, and who most of the people were at least willing to accept, as patriarch. He further threatened to excommunicate the emperors if they did not renounce and reverse this injustice. The Emperor Michael III was too drunk to care, and the Emperor Bardas was too closely tied to Photius and too implicated in the crimes against Ignatius to change now. So Photius replied by excommunicating Pope Nicholas I. So here we have another schism. In 866, Bardas was assassinated. Michael III was far too drunk to care. So someone elevated the murderer of Bardas to the status of co-emperor as Caesar. And that murderer was named Basil. On September 24th, 867, the co-emperor Basil became the sole emperor Basil when he murdered Michael III, Michael the Drunk. So with such a pedigree, the new emperor Basil needed to shore up support. So he wrote to Pope Nicholas I, deploring the actions of his predecessor. Photius was arrested, deposed. Poor Ignatius, astonishingly, he was still alive. He was released and reinstated in his position as patriarch, in which he remained until his death, but though crippled, from his ordeal, for the last 10 years of his life, until he died in 877. Pope Nicholas died the year that Ignatius was reinstated, but Photius, the story of Photius would continue. Before we leave Pope Nicholas, all right, I guess, we'll stop here because next is St. Cyril and Methodius, and I'm seeing the time, and I don't want to just start them and stop in the middle, so we'll pick up with them next time with St. Cyril and Methodius. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.